So, as you can see from the title, I'm looking at stereography, which is sometimes called 3D imaging. So, just coming back to the tabula rasa, this fresh start. So I was just moving on from the summer show. I've been taking photographs for a very long time. So to get back to my naivety, that exploration that you get as an amateur photographer, I like to try and do a technique that I've never used before. That allows me to open my mind, experiment, take on creative challenges brought on by the equipment and the techniques needs to be learned. And I'm always striving for that sort of happy accident to move on into something else. So the journey resumes. Over the summer I went to Arundel, to a village in West Sussex, town in West Sussex, and found this amazing home stereo viewer and got it for a bit of a bargain. They're worth quite a lot of money, so I was really pleased with that. And then went into Brighton and picked up these cards that belonged to the viewer, dated from 1897, and I just really like the aesthetic of them. I like the feel, and it sort of aroused my curiosity to explore further into stereography. So just a definition of stereography is a photographic technique that mirrors human binocular vision, that enables the brain to create the illusion of depth from a flat image. So these are flat images, these are just 2D photographs. But by having a viewer with two lenses in it, it will give you perception of 3D. Okay, it's purely the function of your brain perceiving the world as 3D. So, depth sort of introduce another element, which is we're all familiar with the rule of thirds, how to compose objects on a 2D surface. I now brought in another plane, another depth, as another compositional element. So how would you position things? How do you position props? How do you position people? How do you position the background to emphasise that depth in a photograph? So you've got the perception of depth from where you position the objects in the frame, enhanced by the perception of depth from the stereography technique, which gives you that movement. So I looked at a couple of contemporary stereographers. I particularly like the top chap here, I won't pronounce his name. And his work was placing people in a landscape. And it was important whether people were placed in the foreground or the mid-foreground, and had plenty of difference between the background and the foreground, and quite often the immediate foreground as well. So there's various levels of perception. Andrew Brooks, very modern, totally artificial. He just took a 2D photograph and just photoshopped it to death, and I didn't like it very much. Part of my research was this Viewmaster, which I remember from Christmases past, and they were sold as a rival to postcards. So they had scenic views of famous landmarks, and there's thousands and thousands of discs from them. I found an article in the New York Times that used this stereography using the Viewmaster to train surgeons on open heart surgery and brain surgery. It gives them that depth. So this just re-emphasises this viewing a stereo picture, one's eye can wander over the whole scene from foreground to background. This whole new dimension to explore. I want to try and get people to sort of enter into the photograph. You know, and that belief, discard that belief and walk into the photograph, ideally. So going back to the slides, the cards that came with the viewer, you know, 1879, long time ago, quite early on in the history of photography. So I started looking at that as a historical thing and came across this company in London. Okay, by 1858, they claimed to have 100,000 views. Okay, and gradually stereography lost favour, became unfashionable, and was replaced by these carte de visites, which are sort of like calling cards to present these cards to people. So part of that research was to look at, you know, who were the photographers? Who were the photographers taking these images in the sort of 1800s, turn of the century, and you know, using daylight studios, using props, using backgrounds. Okay, that's a building. That's a 5-story building. You know, substantial building. We've obviously got lots of people coming through the door. You know, how do they use the props? What was the aesthetic? What were the messages being given out by the images they were producing? Why did stereography fade and carte de visites gain in popularity? And what was the social class that was visiting these places? So I looked at the V&A Museum. It's an article called Dating Old Photographs in the Clothes Worn. So if they couldn't date the photograph, they'd examine the clothes, what the shape of the collars, the necklines of the dresses. They could accurately date the photographs within 5 years. So part of what I want to look into is my further practical practice is shooting stereography as a technique, but adopting the aesthetic of the carte de visites. Okay. We've got a prop, we've got a painted background that's painted as a trope de l'or, which is a realistic painting. It's meant to look like reality. But you're painting on a 2D surface, so you're painting a 3D perception or 3D looking image on a 2D surface, and then photographing 3D. But then we looked on a 2D surface. That really did my head in when I tried to work that one out. So they're using artistic techniques to get perspective. We're photographing something in stereography. It's perception of 3D. You're still looking on a 2D surface. This whole change of 2D, 3D, 2D, 3D on a flat image is interesting. Right, moving on. Did some photo shoots. Bought a dress in Exeter. First time I've ever bought a dress, actually. But Steph, thank you very much. Okay, just like the aesthetics. Played around with a Holga stereo pinhole camera. I love the exposure guidelines. About 6 seconds, about 12 seconds, perfect. Set up a studio, a tabletop still life. Looked at landscape. Read about you can use a single camera on a sliding base plate and take left and right images, and then when viewed will give you that stereo effect. Cha-cha-cha. This is used on the moon. So you only put your weight on one leg, take a photograph, and shift your weight to the other leg. And that will just give you that separation between the two images. Just another method of viewing it, that's just using filters and glasses. I actually need to merge those images together. And then going back to that large format, mimicking that formal turn of the century studio, yeah, standing in the street with a blanket over your head. You know, Nick White was helping me out, bless him. Okay, he was just making sure no one bumped into me, no one ran away with my camera. You know, it was really good to have an assistant. I don't think I could have done this shoot without an assistant, because there were so many things going on. I couldn't keep my eyes on everything. So he was just there to make sure no one stole my digital camera whilst I was under a blanket. He also took these photographs. So cool. That's just the results from that experimentation. Practical practice outcomes. So just returning back to where I want to go in the future with this. Use Daylight Studio to create cartography aesthetic. So 4th floor, what's now illustration, used to be a Daylight Studio. So I've had a word with Jim. He's happy for me to use it, as long as there's no one that's not booked out for anything. I'm just going to buy myself a backdrop, maybe get someone in illustration to paint it, get some props, make myself a nice column, play around with that whole load of messages that are in the props. It's all in my sketchbook. There's lots of social messages that people wanted to portray to the viewer.
Sorry to interrupt, I've got to ask.
Yeah.
Why not use a massive photograph behind as background?
Yeah, good idea. Okay. Again, just exploring composition within the frame to emphasise the depth. So in the future, I'm going to be exploring entering into the photograph using stereography. Thank you very much. Any questions?
What do you want to achieve from your perspective angles? You're looking at the 2D on the back of the, taking a 3D image, the 3D image on the back of a 2D surface.
Yeah.
So what do you want to achieve by these images? Is it to get is it to trick the viewer into thinking that they are in the image that's on the 3D image on the 2D background, or is it to give that idea of the aesthetic of the stereograph type? Like
It's all a trick, isn't it? It's all a trick. It's just the way the brain processes information. You know? And that viewfinder, everyone picks up and goes, wow, that's amazing. And this is the age of high definition, high, amazing computer effects. You can pick up a 10 quid toy, and people still go, oh wow, it's almost as if you're there. You know, so I like that added dimension of belief that 3D gives you. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it's all going for the belief.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah,
Sorry, I
please.
went to the toilet. So, how are you going to exhibit your pictures as in one of those things?
I'm going to be wearing a top hat and have a silver cane and a waistcoat and have a booth.
Cool.
So I'm going to roll up. It's going to be a roll up, come and see the amazing, that whole sort of fairground, sort of come and see this performance. It's going to be a theatre show. I mean, that's a long way in the future, and that's an exhibition. But yeah, it's going to be an artefact. It's going to be that sort of fairground, sort of what the butler saw, sort of thing.
How about also I said about the photo thing, but you know you get those those stands that you put your head through. How about those as well?
Oh,
and
right.
having your picture taken, like
Yeah.
you could put one of those in a box.
That brings a background forward, doesn't it? That brings a background actually in front of the person. So that's actually turning the whole thing on its head again. Okay, cheers. Yeah.
That was a great history lesson through this very specific genre
Okay.
of photographic practice. Thanks.
Chris, just following up what you said about the photograph and linking with Lindsay, I could possibly project a photograph onto the wall and use that as my backdrop. Just thinking about it.
But then when the person stands in front, they'll be covered by the image.
You can project to one side, can you?
It's quite hard.
Because they've got the ones up in somewhere or other. They project like they're like right next door, but they're still stuck.
Right.
The photographer I've been working with is a lot of set building, and it just looks so much better when the backdrops are painted.
Sure. That was my original idea.
That is the
Who's the
best
photographer?
Louise Sumner. She's just running for photography video.
Okay.
But she does like, she's just one that she does loads of like fairy tale thing. She's doing like all the.
Send me a link.
Huh?
You send me a link.
Yeah.
John.
Really good opportunity to explore a very historical type of practice that was pre all of these digital mediations of three-dimensional spaces, and to have a comparison actually to see which one enriches somewhat your experience. This one is experiential, you're looking back and dressed up in props, reenacting photographic practice as performance. The other one is exclusively something that exists inside back screens. How do you mould the two together? Is it relevant to mould the two together? Will it be? But great places in which to sort of bat around ideas about how we engage with photographic practice beyond just what we see here in front of our eyes.
One of the most famous photographers for the carte de visite was actually heavily involved in the theatre. So the theatre was, you know, the TV of its day, the sort of celebrities. They'd have celebrity photographs of all these famous actors and thespians and stuff.
There's a film that's new and it's for children, but I enjoyed it, called Hugo.
Okay.
And it has basically the first guy who used props and made fantasy-based films and stuff. Kind of like based on that kind of thing, but it's really cool. I like it. And it has like the whole kind of windy cinema thing.
Sounds good.
It's produced by Joy Depp and Liam Jackson.
So in the presentation as well, I like a very authoritative way of controlling things, but making for a pretty pieced out time for us all, passing around objects, having a very good structured presentation which didn't feel forced at all, just the outcome of naturally very good research, which gives yourself a great platform to build your own knowledge from.
No, I had to cut. I think the thing I've learned from this was how much I had to cut out to actually just focus down onto. Well, I'm sure James is saying you do so much research. I had to deliberately leave stuff out because it was just 10 minutes. I could do an hour presentation if you want me to next week. You know.
One of the main traps of this year again is that being expansive in your research and then editing down what becomes relevant to your very specific type of practice and interest in photography. That's most of the skill of the year, is being able to make decisions about what's important and what's not, and then to move on and make the next one until you end up with a very personal year, I hope, for each person. To be able to keep on going through that process again and again, deciding, dispose of, selection, move on. Just to keep on that as a part of practice. Very good. Good start to the year.
Okay,
Great, thanks.